So far it's been fun. We'll see how my talk goes. So a couple of weeks ago, some of you will remember and others will have no idea. I talked about prosperity and I used the story of the prodigal son as a way to illustrate what we need to do, which is go back home and recognize that there is abundance all around us. And afterwards, actually, Pat asked me, well, what about that other son? So I was like, yeah, what about him? So today my topic is the stay at home brother. So, since I know not everyone was here, I'll just begin by telling you the parable from the beginning instead of just plunging right in. So, and this is a parable that Ernest Holmes, in what is our textbook, The Science of Mind, he said this is a great lesson, possibly the greatest lesson that Jesus taught using this parable. So, here's the story. So a certain man had 2 sons, and his youngest son said to his father, "Father, give me my inheritance now." And the father said, "Okay," and gave his son his portion of inheritance that he was going to get. And so, not many days later, the younger son gathered all his goods and riches together and took off. He took a journey off to the far country, and there he wasted his substance with riotous living. Right? He had a heyday, a crazy heyday, I guess. And then, when he'd spent everything, there arose a mighty famine in that land, that faraway country, and the son began to be in want. He was broke, let's face it. So the prodigal son went and signed up with a local citizen and got a job out in the fields feeding swine. And the prodigal was so hungry that he wished he could even eat the same old husks on the ground that the swine were eating. He was really having a hard time. And no man gave to him. Now this is the lesson, of course, that, we create our own experience. So he created the situation on his own. So then, the prodigal son finally came to himself. He came to himself and he said to himself, how many servants of my father's have bread enough and to spare extra? And here I am, perishing with hunger. I will rise and go to my father, and I will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee, and I am no more worthy to be called thy son. So make me one of thy hired servants. That was his plan. And so he arose, and he went to his father. But when he was still a great ways off, his father saw him and had compassion and ran and fell on the boy's neck and kissed him and hugged him. And this is, the great idea. As Holmes put it, that God turns to us the moment we turn to God. The very moment. It's not actually a long journey. It's the very moment. And it's not just a beautiful thought. It's actually the basis of what it is that we teach here. That there is a power for good, good only, that responds to us without judgment. And so that was kind of where I ended my story a couple of weeks ago, then went on and talked more about prosperity. So, however, that was not the end of the parable. So what happened next in the story? Well, Jesus said that after the prodigal son returned home, he did begin to apologize to his father. The son said, "Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and am no more worthy to be called thy son." But the father said to his servants, "Bring forth the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring hither the fatted calf." I love that, "And let us eat and be merry, for this, my son, was dead and is alive again. My son was lost, and now he is found." And so they all began to be merry. So God never reproaches, God never judges, God is love and must necessarily see all as perfect. We understand this because we understand that the Father in this story is representing the kingdom of heaven. So God doesn't need to forgive, because in the eyes of perfection, everything is already perfect. In the eyes of love, there really can't be anything to forgive, because when you see with love, you know everyone is always doing their best. So the parable portrays the Father as perfectly loving. So what about the other son, the stay-at-home brother? What did he do? The parable continues saying, "Now, meanwhile, the father's elder son was out in the field, and as he came and drew close to the house, he heard the music and the dancing. And he called one of the servants, and he asked him, 'What's going on? What does this mean?' And the servant said, 'Oh, thy brother is come home, and thy father hath killed the fatted calf, because he hath received him safe and sound.' And the brother was angry and would not go in. So the father came out and entreated him, 'Please, come in.' But the son, the older son, answering, said to his father, 'Lo, these many years do I serve thee, and yet thou never even gave me a goat, much less a calf, that I might make merry with my friends.' And the father said to him, 'Son, thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine. Everything is yours.' So, what do you think about that older son? Was he right to feel overlooked and slighted? Was he right to feel like he had never been rewarded or acknowledged properly, while his little brother, once again, no doubt, stole the show, right? I mean, it seems like he had put in long years doing what seemed to be the right thing, trying to stay close to his father, trying to stay respectful, right? Or maybe he was just showing his own character flaws and his own lack of wisdom by feeling resentful and jealous. Maybe he was just having a moment of sibling rivalry. I never had a sibling, but I have a friend who swears that his mother always cooked one less piece of meat than there were children in the house. So, you know, people do, they get jealous of their siblings, we know that. And, or was it something else? Was it really a deeper flaw? Was the older son kind of like that old Grinch in the Dr. Seuss story about the Grinch who stole Christmas? You know, did he just have a heart that was a few sizes too small? So when I was working on this talk, and I guess there are no coincidences, but suddenly up popped a link to a TED Talk on YouTube that was called, "Does Money Make You Mean?" That's it. Well, naturally, since that's what I was thinking about, I watched the TED Talk. And it was by a psychology professor, Dr. Paul Piff. And in his talk on "Does Money Make You Mean?", he started by describing some research studies that they did. One, he went through a lot. One was where they had college students come in, and so they set up a Monopoly game for two students to play against each other. And one student, they gave way more money and other advantages than the other students. So they walked in, they sat down, they didn't know, but they quickly figured out, you know, one had a lot more to begin with than the other. So let's call him the privileged, wealthy student. So then they let them play against each other for a while they used a hidden camera. And when they went back through the hidden camera footage, they found time and time again that the rich player was louder, was more aggressive, banged their play pieces on the playing board more loudly. And I thought this was funny. They even ate more snacks. And the player that was bound to lose. So afterwards, they interviewed the players, and when they asked the rich player why they thought they won, they actually were surprised that most of the rich players explained their great strategy. They had just played better. So another test that they did was they set up someone as a pedestrian who was standing by a crosswalk waiting to cross the street. Not at a light, but at one of those loud little crosswalks where you can get the cars to stop and they go out. And so they set up a camera again, and they just waited to see which cars were going to stop and let the pedestrian cross. And what they discovered was the cheapest cars, every single one, stopped. And they also found there was a correlation that the more expensive the cars were, the less liable they were to stop. Although even in the most expensive group, obviously most people stopped. It wasn't like they all didn't stop. After all, it is the law. You have to stop. But the richer the car was, the more liable they were to break the law and not stop. They had some other examples, but I wanted to sort of jump to the end because they did another test to see what could be done to make people more compassionate. So they took two groups of people, not students, but they took a group of people who earned less than $20,000 or $25,000 a year, and they took a group of people that earned over $100,000 a year. And for each group, one at a time, they had them come into the lab, and they kind of accidentally would meet this planted person who was suffering some kind of distress. And they would happen to meet them in the lobby or something. And then they would see how often a person or how many people would offer help of some kind. And they found out that the people who were less affluent were more liable to help. So the question is, what could be done? Well, interestingly, they found that if they took the group of high earners and they showed them a video about the effects of childhood poverty that was less than a minute long, and then they waited an hour and tested them afterwards, there was no difference. There was no difference. Just that little short video clip was enough to, what I would say, wake people up to, the commonality, to wake up that sense of compassion. So that was all it took. So I think the answer is no, not necessarily that money makes us mean. And the professor suggested that all we needed to do was just talk to people about compassion, cooperation, and generosity, that people respond very well. And I agree with that. So now going back to the parable about the elder son, maybe he wasn't conscious of being jealous about his brother. Maybe it was just an unconscious reaction, that he just let his feelings run away with him unthinkingly. Perhaps he had a chip on his shoulder after working so long and not being recognized. Or, from a metaphysical viewpoint, maybe even though he had stayed near his father, he had not actually stayed with his father. Maybe he hadn't stayed fully aware and fully awake and conscious of the truth that he and his father were one, because the Father represents universal spirit. So, we have the prodigal son who had traveled to the far country and experienced all kinds of consequences, conditions in the material world. And we have the older son who stayed near, but didn't he also experience some consequences and conditions through his own unconscious thought? So he experienced feelings of jealousy. He experienced feelings of resentment, even though he wasn't broke and didn't have to eat the food for the pigs. So before I go back and talk about what Ernest Holmes had to say about the stay-at-home brother, I want to bring up something that Neville Goddard said that I had mentioned last week. He said, God, as your imagination, can never be so far off as to be even near. For nearness still implies separation. We say, nearer, my God, to thee. God may not be way off in the sky or whatever, but we're still seeing separation. Neville said, wherever you are, I am. To say I am is near is to claim that God is another, is separate, but there actually is no other. You and God are one. So I think that could apply very well to the story of the older brother, the prodigal's brother. Well, Ernest Holmes said, when he talked about the story, that the elder brother was thoroughly human in his jealous response. That's what we do. We've all done it. That maybe he was aware that he, the older brother, had not actually entered his father's home, that he was still outside, even though he had been nearby, and so fueled by a feeling of self-righteousness and anger, he didn't want anyone else to enter his father's home either. And then Holmes added a message to the reader, too, saying, I expect that we meet the second brother in ourselves nearly every day. In our personal experiences with other people, in our intolerant attitude and uncharitableness towards others who do not think as we think. But God knows so little about self-righteousness, just like God knows nothing about evil, for both are false. Therefore, the father in the story said to the older son, Thou art ever with me, and all that I have is thine, implying that the elder son had missed the mark, as well as the younger, for he had been living in the midst of plenty and had simply not recognized it. And then I think Holmes was, I don't know, he slipped a little irony into it. He said, both sons were foolish, but it's a question which was the more completely deluded. Which one? Which son? Look at them both. Which one was the most wrong? So I just want to be clear that this parable is not about sibling rivalry at all. The two brothers could have been friends, they could have been sisters, they could have been co-workers, neighbors, they even could have been enemies. It doesn't matter. The brothers represent the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. The younger brother, who really represents our unconscious mind, really wandered off into the far country with no awareness of where he belonged, of what he was, of what his life purpose was. He was so lost, like in a nightmarish dream, really. And finally, you could say that he was kicked away, knocked away by the school of hard knocks, right? So he woke up, and he came to his senses, and he returned home. Home that is not a place, but a state of being. And all he had to do was to be willing to align with Spirit and realize and recognize his true nature, that he was one with the oneness, the child of his Father, universal Spirit. So the unconscious brother, the prodigal, returned from the far country. Now the other brother, who perhaps, I'm going to say, maybe not more like most people, but probably more like you and me here, how we are these days. Maybe in the past, we had some great awakening that knocked us into the right direction. And we started to head in the right direction towards home, that state of oneness, towards that realization of our oneness with good, just like the prodigal. But then what happened along the way? Did we fool around? Like a kid coming home from school and get a little sidetracked? You know, are we just kind of hanging out in the near country, nearer to the truth, but not quite there yet? Now, there's another story that I think you all know. It's not from the Bible, but The Wizard of Oz. How does that story end? In the very end, Dorothy finds out that all she had to do from the very beginning was click her heels 3 times and say, there's no place like home. And there she was. She'd been at home dreaming all along. There are many, many stories like that where the protagonist wakes up and discovers they're right where they belong. They just hadn't realized it. And so the message of this parable of the prodigal son and of his stay-at-home brother is simply, once we recognize the truth that there is already good for us, and accept it, we will discover for ourselves that we are already at home, that we are already embraced by love and feeling joy as we recognize this truth that we are truly one with the thing itself, one with life itself. And so it is. Thank you.
So good.